The Restless Soldier. Hello friends, welcome to the Horror Ghost Stories. The story begins. The night was thick with an eerie chill as Emma stepped into the old theater. She had heard rumors about its haunted past, but nothing could have prepared her for the heavy air that surrounded it. The once grand theater had fallen into disrepair, the velvet curtains fraying and the seats worn down from years of neglect. Yet, something about it called to her. She had always been intrigued by the paranormal, and this place, with its chilling history, promised an experience she couldn't resist. Emma had arrived after sunset, when the moonlight barely touched the cracked windows. As she walked through the lobby, she could hear the faint sound of distant whispers, like echoes of a time long past. She had come alone, against her better judgment, but her fascination outweighed her fear. The legends spoke of the theater being cursed, haunted by the spirits of past performers who met untimely deaths under mysterious circumstances. Some claimed they had heard the soft sound of a violin in the dead of night, while others swore they saw shadowy figures lurking in the rafters. It was said that the theater was alive in its own way, feeding off the energy of those who dared to enter. Emma walked past the ticket booth, the flickering light above casting long shadows across the floor. She pushed open the grand double doors to the main auditorium. The space inside was vast and dark, save for the moonlight that filtered through the dust-covered windows. Rows of empty seats stretched out before her, and the stage loomed like a dark void in the center of the room. A gust of wind sent the curtains rustling, and for a moment, Emma thought she heard the faint sound of laughter. But when she turned, no one was there. She slowly walked down the aisle, her footsteps echoing in the silence. The air grew colder the closer she got to the stage, and the sense of unease deepened with every step. It felt as though unseen eyes were watching her, waiting. Her breath became visible in the freezing air as she reached the front row, just beneath the stage. She took a deep breath and climbed the worn steps, her hand brushing the cold wooden railing. As soon as Emma set foot on the stage, she felt the temperature drop even further, as though the air had thickened around her. She turned in a slow circle, trying to take in her surroundings. The stage, though in decay, still held the remnants of its former grandeur. The velvet curtains hung limply, and the old, dusty props lay scattered about. But it was the mirrors at the far end of the stage that caught her attention. They were large and distorted, covered in layers of grime and age, but something about them felt wrong. Emma approached the mirrors cautiously. As she drew closer, she saw faint shapes moving within them, shadows that seemed to shift with a life of their own. Her heart began to race. She could feel the weight of the space pressing in on her, the air growing thicker and harder to breathe. Her mind screamed at her to leave, but she couldn't move. Something held her there, anchored by an invisible force. A low whisper broke the silence, a voice that seemed to come from the mirrors themselves. "You're not alone." Emma froze. The voice was soft, almost too quiet to hear, but it was unmistakable. She spun around, searching the darkened auditorium, but there was no one there. Her eyes snapped back to the mirrors. The shapes inside them were clearer now, figures that seemed to be slowly emerging from the glass. She took a step back, her pulse pounding in her ears. The air shifted. The temperature dropped to freezing as a figure stepped out from the mirror. At first, it was a blur of shadows, but soon it took the form of a man dressed in a tattered costume, his face pale and contorted in agony. His eyes were empty, hollow sockets, and his mouth hung open as though he had been screaming for centuries. He reached out toward Emma, his fingers elongated and twitching. Emma gasped and stumbled back, her heart hammering in her chest. The man from the mirror stepped closer, his movements jerky and unnatural. He was followed by more figures, women in tattered gowns, their faces twisted in pain, their mouths moving in silent screams. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and Emma could feel the oppressive weight of their presence closing in on her. In a panic, Emma turned and ran off the stage, her footsteps pounding against the worn floor. She bolted for the exit, her breath coming in ragged gasps, but as she neared the doors, they slammed shut with a deafening bang. She reached for the door handle, but it was as though an unseen force was holding it shut. Her mind raced as she turned to face the auditorium once again. The figures from the mirrors had begun to materialize throughout the theater. They were no longer confined to the stage or the mirrors, they were everywhere. The ghostly figures surrounded her, their eyes locked onto hers, their movements slow and deliberate. The whispers grew louder, filling the room with a maddening chorus. "Join us," they said in unison, their voices a cold, hollow sound that sent a chill down Emma's spine. With every step, the figures drew closer, their hands reaching out toward her. Emma stumbled back, her fear overwhelming her. She had to escape. The ghosts were closing in, their hands grazing her skin, cold as ice. She could feel their fingers tightening around her throat, pulling her into their embrace. In a desperate attempt to break free, Emma pushed against the nearest figure, but her hands passed right through it, as though it was made of mist. The more she struggled, the more the figures seemed to multiply, surrounding her, pressing in from all sides. The whispers grew louder, their voices now a cacophony of torment. "Join us, forever," they repeated, as though it were a chant. Emma's vision blurred. Her head spun, and her legs buckled beneath her. She collapsed to the ground, the cold seeping into her bones. Her eyes fluttered shut, and for a moment, she thought she might lose consciousness. But as the darkness closed in around her, she heard one final, chilling whisper, right in her ear, "You are ours now." And then, the theater went silent. The figures vanished, the whispers faded into nothing, and the coldness receded. The doors to the theater opened, letting in the moonlight once more. The silence that followed was suffocating, as if the theater itself had swallowed the very essence of Emma's presence. The next morning, the theater stood empty once again, its decaying structure bathed in the light of a new day. There was no sign of Emma, nor of the torment she had endured. The theater, as always, stood still and silent, awaiting the next soul brave or foolish enough to step inside. And as the clock struck midnight once more, the whispers stirred, waiting for another soul to wander into the haunted theater, never to leave. The air inside the theater grew heavy with tension as Emma lingered at the entrance, uncertainty tugging at her every step. She felt a faint pulse, as if the very walls were alive, breathing in rhythm with her. The shadows cast by the broken fixtures stretched across the floors like fingers, beckoning her deeper into the heart of the place. The dissonant silence hung like a fog, suffocating her thoughts. The atmosphere was thick with an unsettling, almost ancient presence, and for a moment, Emma hesitated, almost convinced that she should turn back. But curiosity, that same insistent pull that had brought her here, nudged her forward. Her footsteps echoed throughout the vast lobby, a lonely sound that seemed to reverberate in every corner of the theater. Faint cracks marred the marble floors, and the walls, once richly adorned with ornate moldings, were now chipped and faded. The chandeliers above hung crookedly, their once brilliant crystals now dull and coated with layers of dust. The ticket booth was abandoned, its glass window broken, leaving an empty, hollow shell of what it once was. The sound of her shoes on the marble was the only noise, yet she couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was watching her. She couldn't resist. The urge to venture further into the theater, to uncover its long-forgotten secrets, was too strong to deny. With a trembling hand, she pushed open the doors to the auditorium. A cold gust of air rushed out from within, the stale, musty scent of disuse filling her nose. The moonlight barely illuminated the space, its silver glow filtering through the grime-coated windows, casting elongated shadows that crept across the floor like creeping vines. As her eyes adjusted to the dim light, Emma could just make out the rows of empty seats, their fabric torn and threadbare, stained by years of neglect. The stage stood before her, a daunting void in the center of the room, its heavy velvet curtains hanging lifelessly, looking as if they hadn't moved in decades. There was an unspoken weight to the place, as though every creaking board and rustling curtain carried the echoes of forgotten performances, of lives once lived here, now faded into dust. Emma's heart raced as the whispers returned, barely audible but unmistakable distant murmurs, like voices carried on the wind. She looked around, feeling an overwhelming sense of déjà vu, as if she had been here before in another time, another life. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. Her feet carried her down the long aisle, each step heavier than the last. She felt as though the very walls were closing in on her, drawing her into something far beyond the world of the living. The temperature dropped sharply, and her breath came out in visible puffs, though the air around her seemed too stagnant to be anything natural. She paused, her eyes drawn to the stage. It loomed before her like a great maw, dark and foreboding. Something about it felt wrong, as if it was no longer a place of entertainment, but a tomb, an eternal resting place for lost souls. Without thinking, Emma found herself ascending the steps to the stage, the cold wood under her feet creaking with each movement. She felt as though the stage itself were alive, pulsing with a dark energy, welcoming her into its grip. The closer she got, the more intense the chill became, a bone-deep cold that seemed to seep through her very skin. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, as if they were now directly surrounding her, swirling through the air like a hurricane of sound. And then, she saw them, ghostly figures reflected in the cracked mirrors at the far end of the stage. At first, they were nothing more than faint shapes, like shifting shadows caught in the corners of her vision. But as she moved closer, the details became clearer, the faces emerging from the fog of time. Their eyes were hollow, their mouths frozen in silent screams. They were performers, their clothes tattered and aged, their bodies contorted in unnatural ways, as if caught between life and death. The reflection of a woman in a beautiful gown flickered before her eyes, only to be replaced by a man with a twisted grin. His eyes were wide and unblinking, empty sockets that seemed to stare directly into her soul. They were not reflections in the traditional sense. No, these were the true inhabitants of the theater, the spirits that had been trapped here, bound to this cursed place for eternity. A shiver ran down Emma's spine, and she froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The air seemed to thicken around her, suffocating her with an unseen force. She couldn't look away from the mirrors, drawn to the twisted faces staring back at her, their movements becoming more deliberate, more real. The woman in the gown stepped forward, her mouth opening slowly, the air around her crackling with a dark energy. "You're here," the woman whispered, her voice like the rustling of dry leaves. It sent a wave of terror through Emma, but she couldn't move. Her limbs felt heavy, as though the very weight of the theater had pressed down upon her, keeping her in place. The temperature dropped even further, the cold gnawing at Emma's bones, and she felt something icy brush against the back of her neck. She spun around to see a figure tall and thin, dressed in an old-fashioned suit emerging from the shadows. His face was pale, a grotesque parody of a human, his eyes too wide, his grin too sharp. He stepped forward with unnerving grace, his movements jerky but deliberate. "You should have never come," he crooned, his voice like nails on a chalkboard. "This place does not let go of those who enter." Emma opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The stage around her was no longer an empty space. It had transformed, like a nightmare, into a living, breathing entity. The walls seemed to pulse with an energy of their own, the shadows stretching unnaturally long, twisting as though they had a life of their own. And then, from the mirrors, more figures began to emerge. One by one, the ghosts materialized, their forms disjointed and distorted, faces twisted in eternal anguish. They reached out for her with icy fingers, their cold hands grazing her skin as she tried to back away. The whispers grew louder, becoming a chorus of mournful voices, begging for release. Emma's heart raced. Her mind screamed for her to run, but her legs wouldn't move. She could feel the icy fingers of the spirits tightening around her, their cold touch wrapping around her like chains. They were pulling her toward the stage, dragging her into the very depths of the cursed theater. The cold, the darkness, the whispers, they all seemed to swallow her whole. Suddenly, the air around her seemed to shift. Time felt like it stood still, the very essence of the place warping and contorting. The ghosts pressed closer, their faces now inches from hers, their eyes burning with an unnatural hunger. "You will join us," they chanted in unison, their voices merging into a haunting, mind-shattering crescendo. With one final, desperate cry, Emma stumbled backward, her body falling to the floor. The temperature dropped to a bone-chilling low, and her surroundings blurred. The faces of the spirits seemed to distort and stretch, their laughter turning to shrill, high-pitched wails. And just like that, everything went dark. When Emma's eyes opened again, she was no longer on the stage. The once ghostly figures now crowded the auditorium, their eyes empty and hollow, their hands reaching toward her. The theater had swallowed her, just as it had so many before her. In the distance, the sound of the faintest violin played a mournful tune. Emma realized too late, the theater had claimed her. She was not a visitor. She was now one of them, a spirit trapped within the walls of the haunted theater, forever doomed to perform for an audience of the lost. And as the clock struck midnight, the theater was once again alive with whispers, waiting for the next soul to wander in and take her place. The darkness in the theater seemed endless, like a deep well pulling Emma further down with every passing second. She could feel the weight of the past pressing in on her, the remnants of the souls that had come before her haunting the very air she breathed. Her breath became shallow, her heart racing as she realized the truth: she had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. The theater, with its cracked walls and creaking floors, was more than a mere building. It was a prison, a soul-trapping void that had ensnared many over the centuries. The spirits that haunted it were not simply lingering remnants, they were restless, trapped, and desperate for company. The instant Emma's body hit the cold, dusty floor, the stage seemed to dissolve around her. The once solid walls warped, stretching out like a grotesque painting gone wrong. The air turned viscous, and she could feel it pressing against her skin, suffocating her in its sticky, unnatural thickness. The temperature plummeted even further, and Emma, trembling uncontrollably, realized with growing horror that the familiar sensation of her body, its weight, its warmth, seemed to be slipping away. Her fingers, which had clutched the stage in panic, now appeared translucent, the skin fading as if she were becoming part of the very air around her. She blinked, and her surroundings warped again, blurring in a haze of impossible shadows. The figures that had once been distant and ethereal now crowded in around her, their forms coalescing into something far more tangible, far more real. Their faces twisted in eternal suffering now looked directly at her, their hollow eyes boring into her very soul. The woman in the gown from before floated towards her first. The tattered dress billowed unnaturally, as though submerged in water. "You can't escape," the woman murmured softly, her voice carrying the weight of centuries. It was a sound that wrapped around Emma's throat like a vice, choking any hope of resistance. "None of us ever did." Before Emma could respond, the man in the tattered suit materialized beside the woman, his gaunt face a grotesque mask of agony. His mouth opened in a soundless scream, and in the blink of an eye, he was joined by others. A child in a worn costume, his face too pale for a living person, a young woman, her eyes wide with terror, her hands clasped together as if praying for salvation. They all hovered, suspended in the air, their figures blurring as if caught between the fabric of the world of the living and the dead. "We were performers," the child said, his voice high-pitched and trembling. "We danced, we sang. We acted, but the show never ended." The child reached out a hand toward Emma, his fingers unnaturally elongated, his eyes wide with pleading. "We tried to leave, but the theater took us. Now we perform, endlessly. Every night, we are called back to the stage." The words echoed in Emma's ears as the full weight of her fate began to sink in. The theater had never been merely a stage for entertainment, it was a prison, a place where the souls of the damned were trapped forever, forced to relive their performances, their deaths, their mistakes, over and over again. It wasn't the building itself that kept them imprisoned, but something much darker, something ancient, a malevolent force that fed on the energy, the fear, and the despair of those who wandered in. The figures surrounding Emma began to sway, their movements jerky and unnatural, as though controlled by some unseen puppeteer. The lights flickered again, and Emma could feel her mind beginning to unravel under the weight of their eyes. The stage, which had once seemed like an empty canvas, now felt like a trap, a great, yawning abyss where she was to be consumed and lost to time. A soft, discordant melody began to fill the air, rising up from nowhere. It was a violin, at first a tentative, hesitant sound, as though it were being played by an unskilled hand. Then the melody grew more haunting, more desperate, as if the violin itself were crying out in pain. The music reverberated through Emma's body, vibrating every nerve, every bone, until it felt as though the sound itself were threading through her soul. The mournful tune was all too familiar, like a forgotten lullaby, one that had been sung in the darkest corners of her childhood nightmares. "Don't listen to it," whispered the woman in the gown. "The music calls you. It pulls you into the performance." The child's pale hand reached out to her again, his expression now distorted with madness. "You will perform with us," he said, his voice becoming louder, more urgent. "You have no choice. It's the only way to survive here. To stay alive." The ghostly figures began to close in around her, their hands reaching toward her, their eyes gleaming with an unsettling hunger. In that moment, Emma understood the true horror of the theater. The spirits weren't simply bound to it, they were the theater. Their souls had fused with the space, becoming part of the very structure of the place, each act, each performance, pulling in new victims to join them in their endless torment. The theater was a living thing, its hunger never satiated, always reaching for more. And Emma was to be its next player, its next pawn in the unending show. Desperate, Emma tried to break free from their grip, but as she struggled, the atmosphere around her thickened, and the ghosts grew more insistent. The music swelled, the violin's notes becoming sharper, more piercing, until Emma thought her skull might split from the sound. She could feel herself being pulled toward the stage again, as though invisible ropes had lassoed her limbs and were dragging her back toward her fate. The curtain, once limp and forgotten, stirred with a life of its own. It began to rise, slowly and deliberately, revealing a stage bathed in an ethereal, unnatural light. But it wasn't the stage that caused Emma's heart to pound in her chest, it was the sight beyond it. In the flickering light, Emma saw rows upon rows of empty seats, their dark, hollow forms filled not with dust, but with ghostly figures, trapped in the same endless loop of performance. Some were clapping, some were weeping, others sat frozen in terror, their faces locked in expressions of horror. These were the audience, the ones who had come to watch, to be entertained, and had never left. They too were part of the show, bound in the same unholy cycle of the theater's curse. "You see," the woman in the gown whispered, her voice like a hiss, "there's no escape. You belong here now. You always have." The stage was set. The audience was waiting. And Emma, her spirit now torn and shattered, knew what her role would be. As the violin's mournful tune reached its crescendo, the ghosts swirled around her, dragging her toward the center of the stage, forcing her to take her place alongside them. Her body became cold, her limbs stiff, as the theater consumed her completely, her soul slipping into the same eternal loop of performance. The final curtain fell with a deafening thud, and in that moment, Emma was no longer Emma. She was part of the theater, part of the show forever. And as the lights dimmed, the audience of lost souls clapped, awaiting the next performance, as the theater's hunger for souls stretched endlessly through the ages. The cycle would begin again with the arrival of the next lost soul. The end.